Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking, well, a truly immense journey. It's a massive historical deep dive, spanning millennia.
It really is.
We're going from the foundational origins of Scripture, think time of the pharaohs, all the way through the pivotal Hellenistic era with Alexander the Great landing, unfortunately, in the horrific devastation of the 20th century.
And then bring you right up to today, wrestling with modern identity, political symbols. It's a lot.
Exactly. We're unpacking Jewish history, the absolute core of its identity, and crucially, this persistent sort of shape-shifting nature of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and it's a monumental task. But the mission here is vital, I think, for understanding so much contemporary geopolitics, historical trauma.
Absolutely.
We're tracing the core of Jewish peoplehood. So that means looking at how its foundational texts were actually put together, how historical forces, everything from that distinct friction back in the Roman Empire, right up to the calculated, frankly, paranoid rhetoric of Adolf Hitler, how these forces shaped this identity.
Leading not just to unimaginable tragedy, but also ultimately to the creation of the modern state of Israel.
Precisely.
So our goal here, for you listening, is to equip you with a precise historical timeline. We want to clarify that intense scholarly debate around the Torah's origins really analyze the terrifying strategies Hitler used to justify genocide and explore the profound meaning and legacy of that catastrophe, the Shoah.
And we will definitely share some genuinely fascinating insights along the way, like just how close the final writing of the Torah actually was to the arrival of Alexander the Great on the scene.
That connection is often missed, I think.
It really is. And crucially, we'll explore why something seemingly simple, like a Star of David necklace, just an ancient symbol of identity, has become such a high-stakes flashpoint for modern hatred and, public tension.
Okay, let's dive in. The ultimate starting point.
Yeah.
The foundation, the scripture itself. The traditional view, right, the classical Jewish belief,
Yeah.
is that Moses literally received the Torah, those first 5 books from God on Mount Sinai, wrote it down, traditionally dated way, way back, maybe 13th century BCE.
That's the traditional timeline, yes, around 1300 BCE. But when you turn to modern critical scholarship, well, it tells a different story about how that text actually came together.
Okay, so what's the scholarly consensus?
The modern consensus is complex, but it's profound. It relies heavily on evidence found within the texts themselves. It generally operates under what's called the documentary hypothesis.
Right, I've heard of that.
And this theory argues, pretty forcefully actually, that the Torah wasn't the product of a single author or Moses writing at one specific time. Instead, it was skillfully compiled, woven together from multiple distinct source documents that evolved over centuries.
Okay, can you define those sources? Because for someone hearing this for the first time, JEDP, it can sound a bit like alphabet soup.
Yeah, it can feel that way. They're basically labels scholars assigned to identify these distinct editorial traditions or, voices within the text. So J stands for the Yahwist source.
Okay.
It's characterized by its use of the personal divine name, YHWH, often pronounced Yahweh, and it often has these very vivid, almost anthropomorphic portrayals of God.
Like God walking in the garden.
Exactly, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Then E is the Elohist source. It tends to prefer the more generic divine name, Elohim, and it presents God as maybe a bit more distant, communicating through dreams or messengers.
Got it.
D is the Deuteronomist. This source is heavily focused on themes of covenant, law, obedience, fidelity. It's mostly found in the book of Deuteronomy, hence the name.
Makes sense.
And finally, P is the priestly source. This one is intensely concerned with ritual purities, sacrifice, genealogies, the structure of the tabernacle, proper worship, very ordered, very structured.
So what's the evidence for splitting it up like this? Why do scholars think these were separate things that got merged?
Well, the evidence lies in things like repetitions, contradictions, and noticeable shifts in style or vocabulary. For instance, you find 2 slightly different accounts of the creation story right at the beginning of Genesis.
Right, chapters 1 and 2.
Exactly. And even within the flood story, scholars see evidence of 2 narratives woven together using different divine names, different numbers of animals, that sort of thing. The theory suggests these earlier traditions, these different perspectives on Israel's history and law, were circulating perhaps for centuries before being combined.
So these older threads were floating around. But when did they actually get woven together into the single authoritative text we now call the Torah? When was the final edit, so to speak?
The consensus points towards the Persian period for that final canonical redaction.
Okay, the Persian period.
Yeah, this is a really vital point that places the definitive compilation roughly in the 5th century BCE, let's say broadly, between 500 and 400 BCE.
Oh.
So while the text is absolutely based on much older oral traditions and probably some written fragments, the authoritative version that really structured Jewish law, identity, and belief for millennia, that was cemented during this relatively late period.
That timing is absolutely critical for context, isn't it? Let's just clarify the time gaps for everyone listening. If we take the traditional view, Moses around 1300 BCE.
Right.
Then you've got roughly 1300 years passing until the estimated birth of Jesus, around 4 BCE.
A huge span.
Very long time. But if we go with the scholarly consensus for the final authoritative redaction, that 5th century BCE date.
So 500 BCE, roughly.
Roughly. Then only about 500 years pass until Jesus' birth. Still a significant period, but much shorter.
Either way, the point is Jesus was born into a world with an ancient, fully formed, established Jewish scriptural tradition. He was reading from the Hebrew Bible, a text that, in its final form, was already centuries old.
Absolutely. It wasn't a new religion developing its text. It was an ancient one he was interpreting and challenging from within.
And here's where it gets really interesting, connecting that scripture to massive external events, specifically Alexander the Great.
Exactly. Alexander sweeps through and conquers the Near East around 332 BCE.
Now remember, we just said the final written form of the Torah was likely complete by around 500 BCE, maybe 400 BCE at the latest.
So the Torah text predates Alexander.
By over a century, maybe closer to 2. So when Alexander's Greek successors, the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed him, took control of Judea, they weren't encountering some primitive tribe. They encountered a people who already possessed an established, ancient, sacred scripture.
This wasn't some new local cult they could just absorb. It was a literate tradition with deep roots.
Precisely. And that encounter actually forced a critical development. You had large numbers of Jews living outside Judea, especially in Egypt, who spoke Greek.
The diaspora.
The diaspora, exactly. So there was a need to translate these ancient Hebrew books into Greek. This led to the Septuagint translation, starting probably in the 3rd century BCE, completed maybe in the 2nd.
And the Septuagint itself becomes proof of the text's age and authority.
It absolutely does. It shows the antiquity and the established authority of the Jewish text, even when faced with this overwhelming wave of Greek culture and language. It demonstrates this deep literary and theological culture that was older than the Hellenistic world Alexander created, and certainly older than the Roman Empire that followed.
Okay, but let's rewind a bit. When we go back to those really early narratives in the Torah, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and especially the Exodus from Egypt, how does that early history hold up against external archaeological evidence? We need to be careful about myth versus fact here.
Yeah, the historical footing. It varies dramatically depending on the period. For those earliest foundational narratives, the stories of the patriarchs, and particularly the massive story of the Exodus.
The cornerstone event.
Absolutely central theologically. But currently, these narratives lack direct external archaeological confirmation. For example, despite extensive searches, archaeologists haven't found large-scale material remains in the Sinai Desert consistent with a massive population wandering for 40 years.
And no mention in Egyptian records.
No contemporary Egyptian state records mention a mass departure of enslaved peoples or the events described in Exodus. So, scholars tend to view these narratives not as outright fabrications, but perhaps as mythologized history or foundational legends.
Meaning they serve a profound theological purpose, explaining the origins of the covenant rather than being a literal historical account.
Exactly. They explain who the people are and their relationship with God. But as we move forward in time, the historical footing gets much, much firmer.
Right. Once we hit the period of the Israelite monarchies.
The evidence improves dramatically. By the time of the monarchy, say around 1000 BCE onwards, we start getting external corroboration. Archaeological finds like the Tel Dan stele.
What's that?
It's an inscribed stone found in northern Israel, dating to the 9th century BCE. Crucially, it mentions the House of David.
Yeah, so non-biblical proof suggesting David was a real historical figure, the founder of a dynasty.
Precisely. It's strong evidence. And major events later on, like the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the elite were deported. That's confirmed in detail by Babylonian records.
So the picture is complex. Beginnings rooted in sacred narrative, becoming increasingly anchored in externally verifiable history over time.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, one final point on ancient identity before we move forward. Language. What was the original language of the Jews? This gets confused sometimes with later languages developed in the diaspora.
The original language of the scriptures in the ancient Israelites was Hebrew. Hebrew is a key member of the Semitic language family.
Which also includes?
Arabic and Aramaic are the other major living ones. And Aramaic is important here because it actually became the common spoken language, the lingua franca, throughout much of the Near East, including Judea, during the Second Temple period around the time of Jesus.
So many Jews back then would have spoken Aramaic in daily life, even if Hebrew was the language of prayer and scripture.
Yes, that's very likely. But then, of course, Jewish history is defined by movement, by exile, by diaspora.
Which led to new languages entirely.
Right. Over centuries, Jewish communities adopted local languages, but often adapted them. The most famous examples are Yiddish, which is essentially a medieval German dialect written with Hebrew letters, spoken primarily by Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe.
And Ladino.
Or Judeo-Spanish, a Spanish-based dialect developed by Sephardic Jews expelled from Spain in 1492. But just for broader context, if you look at the whole Semitic language family today, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, globally, Arabic speakers form the vast majority. Hebrew speakers are actually a linguistic minority within their own ancient language family.
That's a fascinating perspective, important context for understanding both history and, well, modern dynamics. Okay, this linguistic and scriptural identity discussion helps us pivot. Because the history of the Jewish people isn't just about internal identity. It's also inseparable from encountering external resistance, sometimes profound hatred, anti-Semitism. This friction started early, didn't it? Notably with the Roman Empire.
Oh, absolutely. The roots go way back.
What was it about Jewish distinctiveness that caused such conflict in the Roman world?
The core issue was their radical, uncompromising monotheism. In the polytheistic Roman Empire, there was generally tolerance for local gods, as long as you also acknowledged the Roman gods and, crucially, participated in the imperial cult offering sacrifices to the emperor or his image.
Which was seen as a basic sign of loyalty.
Exactly. It was a civic duty, a sign you were part of the Roman order. Jews uniquely refused. They would not worship Roman gods. They would not worship the emperor. This refusal to compromise, to assimilate religiously, was seen by the Romans as deeply problematic.
How so? How did they interpret that refusal?
They interpreted it as fundamentally antisocial, subversive, and even impious insulting to the gods who protected Rome. It marked Jews as stubbornly different, unwilling to integrate into the fabric of the empire.
And this wasn't just popular grumbling. Influential Roman writers codified this resentment, right? Like the historian Tacitus.
Yes, Tacitus, writing around 110 CE, is a key example. His writings are foundational because they really cemented stereotypes that would echo for literally 2,000 years.
What did he say?
He described Jewish practices, monotheism, dietary laws, Sabbath observance as perverse and disgusting. But more than that, he explicitly accused Jews of harboring hatred of all others, odium generis humani, precisely because they kept themselves separate and refused to adopt Roman ways.
So he framed their religious commitment as misanthropy.
Exactly. He saw their distinctiveness not as fidelity to their God, but as insularity and religious obstinacy, which he and many Romans equated with disloyalty to the state and hostility towards non-Jews. This stereotyped the Jew as the inherently separate, disloyal, misnapistic other starts right there.
And if we fast forward to medieval Europe, this ancient resentment gets supercharged with Christian theology, fueling just a devastating pattern of persecution and expulsion.
It's a horrific pattern, and it becomes almost predictable across Western Europe from roughly the 12th century through the 15th. England expelled its Jews under King Edward III in 1290 after decades of increasing financial exploitation and religious hostility.
France, too?
France expelled Jews multiple times in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Whoa.
Rulers would invite them back when they needed their financial skills, then expel them again later.
Yeah.
And the most sweeping, infamous case is the Spanish expulsion in 1492.
The Alhambra Decree.
The Alhambra Decree, issued by Ferdinand and Isabella. It ordered all practicing Jews to convert to Catholicism or leave the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon within months. It ended centuries of Jewish life on the Iberian Peninsula.
What was the toxic mix of reasons driving these expulsions? It seems like it was never just one thing.
No, it was always a combination, a really destructive cocktail. First, you have the primary religious prejudice, the charge you decide.
Blaming Jews collectively for the death of Jesus.
Exactly. This painted them as perpetual outsiders, cursed by God, making persecution seem almost righteous to many Christians. Second, there was intense economic jealousy and scapegoating.
The money-lending role.
Right, because medieval church law generally forbade Christians from charging interest, usury. Jews often fill this necessary economic niche of lending money. While essential for commerce, it made them deeply resented, especially by debtors. It also made them vulnerable.
How so?
Rulers often found it politically convenient to target Jewish creditors. Expelling Jews was a brutally effective way to cancel royal debts owed to them, seize their property, and win popular favor all at once. It was cynical political and economic exploitation fueled by religious hatred.
And alongside these policy reasons, you had these truly horrific fabricated myths used to incite violence, right?
Yes, the fabricated narratives were weapons designed to dehumanize Jews and justify massacres. The blood libel is one of the most monstrous.
What exactly was that?
It was the utterly false accusation that Jews kidnapped and murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, particularly for Passover matzah. It first emerged in England in the 12th century and spread across Europe, leading to countless trials and killings based on zero evidence.
Just pure invention.
Pure malicious invention. And then, during catastrophic events like the Black Death Plague in the mid-14th century,
Jews were blamed for that too.
horrifically, yes. Rumors spread like wildfire that Jews were deliberately poisoning wells to kill Christians. This led to brutal massacres of entire Jewish communities across Europe, scapegoated for a disease that was actually carried by fleas on rats.
This historical context is just vital because it shows how modern anti-Semitism isn't really inventing new ideas. It's just recycling these ancient and medieval tropes, maybe dressing them up in more political or pseudoscientific language.
That is the absolutely essential insight for anyone trying to understand anti-Semitism today. It has deep, persistent roots. If you look at the common themes, the modern tropes identified by organizations like the ADL.
The 7 main ones?
Right. You can trace almost all of them directly back to these earlier periods, back to Rome or the Middle Ages. The packaging changes, but the core accusations remain disturbingly similar.
Okay, let's quickly run through them, connecting the dots. First, the oldest charge, deicide.
Still there. The core belief that Jews, as a people, are collectively responsible for Jesus' death. Even though the Catholic Church officially repudiated this charge in 1965 with Nostra Aetate, it remains a foundational belief for many Christian extremists and anti-Semitic groups.
Then greed and finance, directly from the medieval money-lending resentment.
Exactly. Today, it manifests as the pervasive conspiracy theory about shadowy Jewish control over global finance, banks, Wall Street, the media, all supposedly manipulated for Jewish profit and power.
Which blends right into the third trope, power and conspiracy. This one seems especially potent globally.
It really is. This is the ultimate paranoid fantasy. The idea of a secret Jewish cabal nefariously controlling world governments, politics, media, maybe even historical events from behind the scenes.
And the textbook example of this is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Absolutely. That document is the centerpiece. It's a proven forgery, manufactured by the Tsarist secret police in Russia around 1903.
A forgery.
A complete and utter forgery. Scholars call it a clumsy one even. It was intended to blame Jews for Russia's political problems and divert attention from the failing regime. It purports to be the minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders plotting global domination.
And even though it's been debunked countless times,
It remains tragically influential worldwide. It's been translated into numerous languages and still circulates widely, especially online and in the Middle East. It provides the supposed proof and the operating manual for almost every modern conspiracy theory about hidden Jewish power. It fuels the idea that Jews are behind everything bad.
which allows them to be blamed for opposing things simultaneously, right?
Precisely. Like blaming Jews for both capitalism and communism, which makes no logical sense but feeds the paranoia. Hitler was a master at exploiting this.
Okay, next trope. Disloyalty. The idea that Jews are inherently more loyal to each other, or maybe now to Israel, than to the countries they live in.
And you can hear the echo of Tacitus right there, can't you? That Roman critique of insularity and refusal to assimilate, reframed as modern political disloyalty. It's the same core accusation.
Then there's blood, modern versions of the blood libel.
Yeah, sometimes manifesting as grotesque accusations about organ harvesting or just a general association of Jews with death, disease, or some kind of dark ritualistic practice involving blood. It taps into those ancient visceral fears.
And then, specific to the last century, denial or distortion of the Holocaust.
Yes, ranging from outright denial that it ever happened to minimizing its scale or significance to what's often called Holocaust inversion.
What's that?
That's the particularly vile tactic of comparing Jews or Israelis to Nazis, thereby attempting to erase or negate the unique historical reality and trauma of the actual Holocaust. It's a way of flipping the victim-perpetrator narrative.
And finally, the seventh trope, which is very contemporary, using anti-Zionism as a cover.
Right. Using criticism of the policies of the State of Israel, which can be legitimate political discourse, as a way to express or mask underlying anti-Semitic beliefs about Jewish peoplehood, Jewish power, or the very right of Jews to self-determination.
And as we'll discuss later with the Star of David, that line can become incredibly blurry, or even meaningless in practice.
In many modern contexts, sadly, yes. The targeting often reveals the underlying animus isn't just political.
Okay, we absolutely have to shift now to the apex of this hatred, the point where all these historical tropes, these rhetorical strategies, this dehumanization coalesced into an industrial program of genocide. I want to focus specifically on Adolf Hitler's rhetoric. He wasn't just a brute, he was a master strategist, wasn't he? Especially in how he used language.
He was chillingly effective, and understanding his strategy requires understanding his audience. In 1933, when he came to power, Germany had about 60 million people. Overwhelmingly Christian, roughly 40 million Protestants, 20 million Catholics.
And the Jewish population.
Tiny in comparison, less than 500,000, less than 1% of the total population. So Hitler couldn't just launch a purely racial attack out of the blue. He needed to frame his agenda in a way that resonated with, or at least neutralized, this massive Christian majority.
He had to make it seem acceptable.
No,
or even righteous.
Exactly. He needed to assure them that his radical Nazi movement wasn't some atheistic Bolshevik threat to traditional values, but rather a defender of German culture and, crucially, Christian morality against perceived corrupting influences.
And he did this by deliberately blending his virulent racism with a kind of grotesque religious justification, framing it almost as a holy struggle.
Precisely. The most explicit example is right there in his book, Mein Kampf. He doesn't just state his hatred, he claims divine backing for it.
What does he write?
He writes, and this is a direct quote, "Hence today I believe that I am acting in accordance with the will of the Almighty Creator. By defending myself against the Jew, I am fighting for the work of the Lord."
Wow. So he frames genocide as obedience to God.
It's a terrifying rhetorical move. It elevates his political program, his anti-Semitic obsession, into a divinely ordained mission, a necessary act of cleansing to restore moral order, appealing directly to a religious worldview.
And he carried this exact strategy into his political actions too, didn't he? Like in his big speech to the Reichstag in 1933, when he was trying to get the Enabling Act passed, basically granting him dictatorial powers.
Yes, that speech is critical. He needed the support, or at least the acquiescence, of the Catholic Center Party deputies. So he explicitly reassured them. He promised the Nazi government would protect the rights of the Christian confessions, see them as the foundation of national morality.
While simultaneously promising to root out.
Simultaneously promising to burn out the poison of immorality that he claimed had infected German culture, specifically mentioning literature, theater, and the press, and fill them again with the spirit of Christianity.
The genius and the absolute deceit of it is how he bundled everything together.
That was the core of the strategy. He took every complex societal anxiety, the trauma of World War I, economic depression, rapid cultural change, modernism, secularism, communism, capitalism, and blamed it all on one single identifiable scapegoat, the Jew.
The universal enemy.
The universal enemy. By portraying the Nazi Party as the staunch defender of traditional Christian values, German culture, and moral purity against this supposed Jewish threat, he successfully mobilized, or at least gained the passive consent of, a majority population against a tiny, marginalized minority.
And as you hinted at earlier, the premise itself was built on that deep-seated paranoid contradiction, echoing the protocol.
Absolutely. That's the ultimate political con game. He blamed Jews simultaneously for being the greedy masters of international finance and capitalism, and for being the leaders of the godless Bolshevik Revolution aiming to destroy private property.
They couldn't possibly be both.
Logically, no. But in the realm of conspiracy theory and scapegoating, it doesn't matter. He created this paranoid fantasy where Jews were the shadowy puppet masters pulling the strings behind every complex societal problem, every opposing force. The premise was a monstrous lie, and the methods, as we know, were genocidal.
That ideology leads directly, inexorably to the Holocaust. We need to be crystal clear about the definition, the meaning, the terminology surrounding this event.
The Holocaust, or as it's known in Hebrew, the Shoah, refers to the systematic, state-sponsored, industrialized genocide of the European Jewish people carried out by Nazi Germany and its collaborators.
Primarily between which years?
The most intense period of mass murder was between 1941 and 1945. It resulted in the murder of approximately 6 million Jews.
6 million.
6 million. That represented about two-thirds of the entire Jewish population of Europe at the time. Utterly devastating.
Let's talk about the terms. Holocaust.
Holocaust comes from Greek holocaustos, meaning whole burnt offering. It evokes this image of complete destruction, often by fire. It became the common term in English after the war.
And Shoah.
Shoah is the Hebrew word for catastrophe or destruction. Many people, particularly Jews, prefer this term because it avoids the religious connotation of sacrifice inherent in Holocaust. It emphasizes the unique, unprecedented nature of this specific historical calamity, without any implication of divine purpose or offering.
What made this genocide different from historical massacres or pogroms? Why is that word industrialized so critical?
Because this was the calculated culmination of Hitler's final solution to the Jewish question. This wasn't spontaneous mob violence, so that happened too. This was meticulously planned, bureaucratically organized, technologically implemented mass murder on an industrial scale.
Using the mechanisms of the modern state.
Exactly. Using railways, efficient killing methods like gas chambers, record keeping, all the tools of modern bureaucracy turned towards the goal of total annihilation. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 is a chilling example.
What happened there?
It wasn't a meeting to decide whether to kill the Jews. That decision had already been made. It was a high-level meeting of senior Nazi and SS officials to coordinate the logistics, how to round up millions of people across Europe, transport them efficiently, kill them, and dispose of the bodies. It was the bureaucratic planning of genocide.
So the goal was nothing less than total annihilation, uniquely targeting the Jewish people.
Absolutely. While the Nazis persecuted and murdered many other groups, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, homosexuals, Soviet prisoners of war Jews were uniquely targeted for complete systematic extermination wherever Nazi power could reach, regardless of age, gender, belief, occupation, or nationality. If you were defined as Jewish by Nazi racial laws, you were marked for death. It was a state-sponsored campaign aiming to eradicate an entire people from the earth.
And out of that unimaginable trauma, that abyss, came perhaps the most direct political consequence: the renewed, urgent drive towards creating the State of Israel.
The Shoah provided the ultimate terrible justification for the Zionist movement, which had been advocating for a secure Jewish national home since the late 19th century to escape European anti-Semitism. The world, reeling from the revelations of the death camps, couldn't ignore the argument anymore.
The moral climate shifted.
Dramatically. The need for a refuge, a place where Jews could control their own destiny and defend themselves, seemed undeniable to many in the international community. This led directly to the UN vote in November 1947.
Resolution 181, the Partition Plan.
Right. Recommending the partition of British Mandate Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states. The Jewish leadership accepted the plan. Arab leaders rejected it.
And the timeline after that UN vote was incredibly fast, wasn't it? Underscoring the urgency felt at the time.
It was immediate. As soon as the British mandate expired, on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion stood up in Tel Aviv and proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel.
And recognition followed quickly.
Remarkably quickly. U.S. President Harry Truman recognized the new state literally 11 minutes later. The Soviet Union followed shortly after. Israel was admitted to the United Nations in May 1949.
But that declaration wasn't the end of the story, obviously.
No, it was the beginning of a new chapter of conflict. The declaration immediately triggered an invasion by neighboring Arab states, leading to Israel's War of Independence. And that, of course, ignited the complex, protracted Arab-Israeli conflict that continues to shape the region and global politics to this very day.
So the creation of Israel and the enduring trauma of the Holocaust profoundly shape modern Jewish identity. And this brings us back to symbols, specifically the Star of David, the Magen David.
The Shield of David.
Right. It's such an ancient geometric symbol, but its journey is so intertwined with this history we've been discussing. It's gone from being simply a symbol of identity to, well, a real lightning rod for modern hatred.
Its history perfectly encapsulates the larger Jewish narrative, doesn't it? The six-pointed star shape itself is ancient, found in various cultures, but its specific, widespread association with Judaism really only solidified in relatively recent centuries, maybe the 17th to 19th centuries.
And then the Zionist movement adopted it.
Yes, the first Zionist Congress adopted it in 1897, making it a symbol not just of faith, but also of national aspiration. And of course, it's now central to the flag of Israel.
But we absolutely cannot forget the other side of its symbolism.
We cannot. The Nazis brutally inverted its meaning. They forced Jews across occupied Europe to wear a yellow Star of David, often inscribed with the word Jude, as a public badge of shame, a marker for discrimination, segregation, deportation, and ultimately annihilation.
That horrific history is precisely why contemporary attacks on the Star of David feel so deeply personal and threatening, isn't it? These aren't just abstract political disagreements.
They feel like direct echoes of that persecution. When you see the Star of David being targeted today, it carries the weight of that history. The recent examples are profoundly disturbing because they show how normalized this kind of intimidation is becoming.
Like the incident in Edinburgh in 2024.
Right, where police reportedly told a Jewish man attending a rally to hide his Star of David necklace for his own safety. The justification: that the symbol itself would set them off, meaning provoke the anti-Israel protesters.
The implication being that the victim needs to hide their identity to prevent the aggressors from reacting.
It's an astonishing inversion of responsibility. It's essentially telling Jews that their visible identity is the problem, that public space isn't safe for them unless they conceal who they are. It's institutional capitulation to intimidation.
And then there was the symbolic erasure on the Amy Winehouse statue in London.
Yes, during the Gaza conflict, someone placed a sticker precisely over the Star of David necklace depicted on her statue. They didn't deface her face or name, just the symbol of her Jewish identity.
Making the target unmistakable.
Absolutely. It moves the act decisively away from any kind of legitimate political critique of Israel and squarely into the realm of targeting Jewishness itself, erasing Jewish identity from the public sphere. And then you have the outright vile tactic of Holocaust inversion.
The swastika star images sent to Jewish students.
Explicitly equating Jews with their murderers. And disturbingly, in some cases, authorities were initially hesitant to classify these as clear hate crimes, sometimes dismissing them as non-crime hate incidents.
So the critical takeaway here is that when this symbol, the Star of David, is targeted because it signifies Jewish identity, whether that's religious, cultural, or national identity tied to Israel, the act really transcends political debate.
It moves squarely into racialized hatred. The symbol signifies belonging and peoplehood, a history that, as we've established, predates the modern state of Israel by centuries. Attacking it is often a way of saying that Jewish identity itself is unacceptable, unwelcome. In these contexts, arguing about the fine line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism becomes almost irrelevant. The impact is anti-Semitic.
Okay, let's pivot slightly now to Jewish identity itself and tackle some common misconceptions about Jewish faith and practice. These circulate widely, often just due to lack of knowledge. Let's start with a really common one: tattoos and burial.
Yes, the persistent myth that a Jew with a tattoo cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery.
True or false?
False. Unequivocally false, according to mainstream Jewish law. The Torah, Leviticus 19.28, does contain a prohibition against tattoos. You shall not etch marks upon yourselves. This is traditionally understood as relating to ancient pagan mourning practices, but nowhere in the Talmud or subsequent codes of Jewish law does it state that having a tattoo disqualifies someone from burial in a Jewish cemetery.
So where does the myth come from?
It likely arose from specific policies adopted by some individual cemeteries or burial societies, perhaps in the 20th century, maybe influenced by Holocaust survivors' sensitivities regarding tattooed numbers. But it's not a universal religious law. Most rabbis and cemeteries today would absolutely permit burial for a Jew with tattoos.
Good to clarify. Another big misconception: the idea that all Jews are deeply religious, orthodox, maybe living in closed communities, rejecting outsiders.
That stereotype just doesn't match reality, especially in diaspora communities like the U.S. or even in Israel. Large numbers of Jews identify primarily ethnically or culturally rather than religiously. They consider themselves secular.
What are the numbers, roughly?
In Israel, estimates suggest around 40–45% of Jews identify as secular, Hiloni. In the United States, it's probably closer to 50%, maybe even higher, depending on how you define it. Orthodox Jews, those who adhere most strictly to traditional interpretations of Jewish law, are actually a relatively small minority.
How small?
In Israel, they make up maybe 10–13% of the Jewish population, combining Haredi and modern Orthodox. In the U.S., it's estimated around 10% of Jewish adults identify as Orthodox. So the image of the typical Jew being ultra-Orthodox is just statistically incorrect.
Okay, what about intermarriage? There's often an assumption that Judaism strictly forbids marrying non-Jews.
Well, traditional Jewish law, halakha, particularly as interpreted by Orthodox and conservative movements, does traditionally discourage or forbid intermarriage, aiming to preserve Jewish continuity. However, Reform Judaism, the largest denomination in the U.S., generally permits rabbis to officiate at interfaith weddings. And from a purely statistical standpoint,
It's common.
extremely common, especially among non-Orthodox Jews in the U.S. Studies show intermarriage rates are very high, perhaps around 60% overall for Jews who married since 2000, and closer to 80% for non-Orthodox Jews. So while it remains a point of internal debate and concern for some about continuity, for a large segment of the Jewish population, particularly in America, intermarriage is a widespread and accepted reality.
Now, the absolute core theological difference between Judaism and Christianity, the Messiah.
This is the fundamental split. Judaism absolutely believes in the coming of Messiah, a future human leader, descended from King David, who will redeem Israel, rebuild the temple, gather the exiles, and usher in an era of universal peace and knowledge of God. But Judaism does not believe that Jesus of Nazareth was that Messiah. Christians believe he was. Jews believe the Messiah is yet to come because the messianic prophecies, like ending war, universal peace, etc., were not fulfilled during Jesus' lifetime. That core disagreement is what led to Christianity branching off as a separate religion.
Finally, let's touch on the afterlife. Does Judaism have the traditional heaven and hell concepts familiar from Christianity?
Not really in the same way. The Hebrew Bible itself is relatively vague about the afterlife. Later rabbinic thought developed ideas, but there isn't the highly structured, detailed description of eternal damnation in hell or blissful reward in heaven that you'd find in much of Christian theology, particularly stemming from the New Testament or Dante.
So what concepts do exist?
There's the concept of Olam Haba, the world to come, which can refer either to the Messianic age on earth or a spiritual afterlife. Some traditions speak of Gehenna, often translated as hell or purgatory, but it's generally conceived as a temporary place or process of spiritual purification, typically lasting no more than 12 months, not eternal punishment.
So the focus is different.
The primary focus in Judaism is much more on this life, on performing mitzvot, commandments, ethical behavior, repairing the world, tikkun olam. How one lives here is paramount. The afterlife is acknowledged, but its specific mechanics are less central and less defined than in some other faiths.
Okay, moving from belief to practice. Certain Jewish rituals have also come under intense scrutiny, sometimes for legitimate ethical reasons, sometimes, sadly, used as a cover for anti-Semitism. Let's talk about kosher slaughter shechita.
Shechita is the method of slaughter prescribed by Jewish law. It involves a very quick, deep transverse cut across the neck with an extremely sharp, perfectly smooth blade, performed by a trained ritual slaughterer, the shoshay. The cut severs the trachea, esophagus, carotid arteries, and jugular veins. Crucially, the animal cannot be stunned beforehand.
Why no stin?
Because Jewish law requires the animal be perfectly healthy and uninjured at the moment of slaughter. Many stunning methods like captive bolt stunning cause injury or render the animal unconscious in a way that might violate these laws. This no stunning aspect is the main point of controversy.
So what's the argument for it being humane despite the lack of pre-stunning?
Proponents, including some animal welfare experts like Dr. Temple Grandin, argue that when shechita is performed correctly with a razor-sharp knife, a flawless cut, and proper animal handling, the massive rapid blood loss causes an almost instantaneous drop in blood pressure to the brain, leading to rapid, irreversible unconsciousness.
So potentially very quick loss of sensibility.
Potentially, yes. Dr. Grandin's research suggests that done perfectly, the animal may lose consciousness within seconds, reacting less to the cut itself than to the restraint. The emphasis is on the skill of the shoshay and the sharpness of the blade, ensuring a clean cut with minimal pain. It fulfills the Jewish mandate to minimize animal suffering. Dar balai chaim.
But critics disagree strongly.
They do. Critics point to studies measuring brain activity that suggest consciousness might persist for longer, potentially up to 30-60 seconds or even more in cattle, especially because the vertebral arteries supplying some blood to the brain aren't always severed by the shechita cut. They argue that modern stunning methods provide a more certain guarantee of immediate unconsciousness before the cut.
And there have been issues with handling methods too, right?
Yes, certain older restraint methods, particularly inverted slaughter using shackles and hoists, have been widely condemned as causing significant animal distress and are now banned in many places, including the U.S. for large animals. Kosher authorities generally condemn these methods too, insisting on upright, less stressful restraint. It's also crucial to note, though, that opponents of bans on shechita and halal slaughter often point out that such legislative efforts are frequently pushed by groups with anti-immigrant or anti-Semitic Islamophobic agendas, using animal welfare as a convenient pretext while ignoring broader issues in industrial farming.
It's complex. Another practice that faces both ancient and modern criticism is circumcision, Brit Milah.
Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision performed on the 8th day of a Jewish boy's life, is a fundamental commandment, a sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. But yes, it's faced opposition throughout history.
Even back in antiquity.
Oh yes. During the Hellenistic period, Greek culture idealized the perfect male body, and circumcision was seen as mutilation, barring circumcised men from competing naked in the Olympic Games. Later, the Roman Emperor Hadrian tried to ban it outright in the 2nd century CE, viewing it as barbaric, which was one factor contributing to the Bar Kokhba revolt.
And modern criticism.
Modern criticism often comes from the intactivist movement, framing circumcision as unnecessary, cruel, a violation of bodily autonomy, or genital mutilation. This is obviously highly contested by religious proponents who see it as a vital covenantal act with minimal risk when performed properly. There's also specific controversy around a practice within some ultra-Orthodox communities called Metzitza Bife. It involves the mohel, circumciser, using direct oral suction on the wound after the circumcision. Public health officials, like in New York City, have identified this practice as posing a significant risk of transmitting infections, particularly herpes simplex virus, HSV-1, to newborns, sometimes with devastating consequences. This has led to regulations and intense debate within and outside the Orthodox community.
Okay, one last quick point on practice and identity. The mezuzah. That little case you see on the doorposts of Jewish homes, what's the issue when non-Jews use it?
The mezuzah contains a small scroll inscribed with specific Hebrew passages from the Torah, primarily the Shema prayer, which declares the oneness of God and the commandment to love God. Affixing it to the doorpost is a mitzvah, a commandment reminding Jews of God's presence as they enter and leave their home.
It's a declaration of faith.
Exactly. It's meant to be part of an active Jewish life within a Jewish home. The issue arises when non-Jews, sometimes including certain Messianic Christian groups, display a mezuzah perhaps as a kind of good luck charm, a decorative object, or a symbol of affinity with Hebrew roots, but disconnected from the actual commandment and Jewish identity.
So it raises questions of cultural appropriation.
Yes, within the Jewish community there's debate. Is it harmless appreciation, or is it disrespectful appropriation, trivializing a sacred ritual object by turning it into a mere decoration or talisman without understanding or fulfilling its religious purpose? Many lean towards viewing it as inappropriate or disrespectful when used outside its intended Jewish context. So we've covered such vast, demanding territory today. We've traced Jewish identity right from the complex formation of its foundational scripture written over centuries, finalized just before Alexander the Great arrived, setting the stage for that crucial Septuagint translation.
All the way through millennia of endurance and, sadly, persecution.
Exactly. We've seen how deeply rooted this identity is, and we've also seen how political and religious rhetoric from Tacitus in ancient Rome through medieval libels right up to Hitler's calculated, cynical speeches appealing to his Christian base has consistently, falsely painted Jews as this insidious other responsible for every complex societal ill.
And we link that directly to the trauma of the Holocaust, the Shoah, that systematic, industrialized catastrophe, and the profound drive for resilience that followed, culminating in the founding of the State of Israel.
The Holocaust really stands as the most extreme, terrifying example of where unchecked lies, paranoid conspiracy theories, and the systematic dehumanization of any group can ultimately lead. Its legacy, as you said, is twofold. The creation of Israel as a refuge, a place of sovereignty, and hopefully a global commitment, however imperfectly realized, to never again.
Never again.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to consider, connecting all these threads. That symbol, the Star of David. Whether worn proudly or increasingly hidden in fear, it represents a peoplehood and a history that, as we've discussed, predates the modern state of Israel by centuries.
It's an ancient symbol of identity.
It is. Now, if history confirms from the Roman Empire, resenting Jewish insularity to contemporary situations where Jewish symbols are deemed too provocative for public space, that the rejection of Jewish presence is often rooted, fundamentally, in the inability or unwillingness of a majority culture to tolerate difference, to tolerate distinct identity.
Then what does the rising pressure today in some quarters to hide Jewish identity, to conceal that Star of David necklace, tell us about the real state of pluralism and tolerance in our own societies right now?
That's the question to really sit with. What does it say about our collective ability to live with difference when visible identity becomes a safety risk?
A powerful question that links the ancient world directly to the tensions we see unfolding today. Thank you for joining us for this really extensive deep dive.
Thank you.
We will see you next time.